You're listening to the Vent Podcast, where we bring you interviews and stories from around the world of wine and spirits. From winemakers and critics to sommeliers and master distillers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping the future of today's food and drinks culture. Enjoy the show. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Vent Podcast. My name is Billy, and you may notice the intro is a little different today because I am without my trusty co-host, Brady. He is off on holiday with his family and friends. So today I have something a little special for you, inspired by our guest for today, Alice Feiring. She is an author. She's a wine writer. She's been writing for decades. She's amazing. Our interview really provided a lot of unique points of view on how wine has progressed from the 90s into the 2000s, where it is today, and kind of how she played a role in helping vocalize some of these aspects of the change, especially kind of pushing back against the quote unquote Parkerization of wines in the late 90s and early 2000s. Basically, a lot of wines trying to emulate a couple singular styles depending on their color. But she also wrote a number of other books, including her latest book, which is kind of a memoir through wine, basically it's more about her life, but through like different special bottles and wines in her life. So we'll touch on that, and we'll give you the name of that as well in the actual podcast, and it'll be in the notes as well. But before we get to this interview, we are going to do a book-centered episode, mini episode. I have 5 of my favorite wine books, including her book, The Dirty Guide to Wine, that she worked on with Pascaline Lepelletier. And I wanted to kind of walk you guys through why I like all of these books. Again, by no means, they're not necessarily these aren't the be-all, end-all. I love wine books, so I read a lot. So don't think these are the 5 you only should have. There's a lot more out there, and I think we'll probably have a couple episodes on it. But these are 5 that I think are kind of fun from like a storytelling travel point of view. They're a little bit more interesting reads than maybe some that get really technical or some that become more reference books. So without further ado, let's dive into the books and then get to our interview. Book number 1. This was my very first wine book. If you're on YouTube, you'll be able to see these, but it is Wine and War. Basically, the description here is the French, the Nazis, and the battle for France's greatest treasure. What is really interesting about it is basically it talks about wine during World War II from the point of view of different people in the wine space. So one is from like a producer in Bordeaux. One is from somebody who lives in Champagne. One is from a merchant who lives elsewhere. So basically what you're getting is kind of the point of view of the war through a wine person's point of view. So whether they be a merchant, a grower, basically showing how the war and all of its great impacts also had these impacts on wine and how wine helped some people get through the war. Fascinating book. It also talks about kind of the French and the Americans racing to the Eagle's Nest where Hitler had stored a bunch of wine. It's a really interesting story. Highly recommend it. It was the first book that I ever read about wine, and it kind of got me into the subject, learning more. It was my first kind of touch point on like viticulture and some other things. So really interesting book. I highly recommend it if you're into history, if you're into wine. Definitely recommend it. Wine and War by Don and Patty Gladstrup. I've never actually read their names. The next book I've recommended this various times on the podcast, but kind of moving forward in history. So those were the 1940s. We're moving forward now to Adventures on the Wine Route. Again, you can see it on YouTube by Kermit Lynch. What I really like about this is, for those of you who know, or don't know, I guess, Kermit Lynch is basically one of the most famous kind of wine merchants, importers in the United States, bringing a lot of really interesting, well-made wines into the U.S. He prided himself on going to these producers, really understanding how the wines were made. In this book, he really wants to kind of find the producers who are really producing wines with a sense of personality, a sense of place. And this book is like half a travel book, half kind of a wine book. And he really vividly just describes what the vineyards were like, what his drives were like, and kind of gives you a really in-depth look at what driving around France. I think it's maybe it's the 80s, 70s, 80s. But I can just open it to any chapter, and basically he goes to different regions. You guys might remember I went to Provence in May. He basically wrote a chapter about a couple of vineyards there that I got to see. And it's kind of cool just basically to hear his point of view on wine. Also, it's interesting how things have kind of come full circle, because when he's writing this, things are kind of moving towards the really clean stainless steel, a lot of creating wine that was kind of more for mass very clean wines rather than moving away from some of the old traditional methods. And also the same way in the vineyard, talking about types of viticulture and then moving into the winery, talking about unfined and unfiltered wines, which a lot of the same conversations we're having again today. So it kind of really shows kind of the cyclical nature of wine. It's just a great wine book, gets you really excited, makes you want to go have a drink from any chapter that you just finished. So again, highly recommend Ventures on the Wine Route by Kermit Lynch. The next book is probably, it might be up there with one of my favorites because for those of you who haven't picked up already on the podcast, I love travel and I love obscure varieties of grapes. So this next book, Godforsaken Grapes by Jason Wilson, is absolutely one of my favorites because basically what he does is travels to different areas, especially predominantly in Europe, and basically goes and visits folks producing wines from grapes that are maybe lesser known in the US or lesser known even in their own regions, that people are making a lot of care and taking time to bring back and revitalize. Sometimes these grapes are very grown in single digit hectares. Sometimes they're a little bit more widely known where they're grown, but not in the US. So it starts, I'm not going to give it all away, but basically he goes from areas in like Switzerland at really high altitude vineyards with varieties like Chasselas and some other things. That's like the most well-known one from there, if that rings any bells, because Chasselas, not many people drink a lot of Chasselas anyway. He goes over to Austria, has some really interesting things there, and Alto Adige, Portugal, goes and kind of dives into some of those varieties. He basically weaves a lot of this narrative about, and then the term Godforsaken Grapes came from a Parker article where he was talking about certain varieties and basically trying to highlight their nuances, people taking great care to make these wines, the great wines that are coming from them. Some of them are catching on more in the US, some he's trying to raise awareness for. And it's all through this lens more of storytelling. It's kind of like a half travel book, half Anthony Bourdain travel book meets wine book. And then again, with some anecdotes from like the wine bar that he runs and some other things that he does to kind of promote the awareness of these varieties. So highly recommend it. One of my favorites. I listened to it. I clearly have the book, so you can listen to it on Audible, listen to it, or read it. Godforsaken Grapes, Jason Wilson. Great book. Next one we've touched on before. I just think it's still interesting and kind of relevant as more people become aware, I guess, or encounter skin contact wines. The Amber Revolution, with the lower subtitle kind of being How the World Learned to Love Orange Wine. I still think this wine is very, very prescient. It's by Simon J. Wolfe, and it came out a few years ago, but I still think more and more people are discovering orange wines, general skin contact wines. And I think it's really interesting to read this book and kind of learn about the regions that were traditionally making orange wine, how it's not basically a new fad, but how it did need to be revitalized in certain areas where it came from, kind of the different range of styles, what orange wines kind of was supposed to be in these different areas. It's just like today, when somebody says red wine, you want to know where it's from. And kind of this, that really dictates what the style is. If it's going to be Burgundy, it's going to be drastically different than Barossa Valley Shiraz. So it's just interesting to kind of dive into that and think about orange wine, not necessarily as a monolith, not like a thing that tastes a certain way, or I don't like orange wine, and not a thing that can be just quickly made in a haphazard manner. There's a lot of thought and nuance that goes on to it. There's regional variations of skin contact in orange wines, and the New World in certain areas, especially in California, it seems like people are really trying to discover what their expression might be. And it's really cool to kind of taste these wines and go through, and you can see the ones that were maybe made for just sales sake and they want to basically hop on the orange wine bandwagon, where other ones took a lot of time and thought, and you can like really dive into the process and the structure of those wines. So again, Amber Revolution by Simon J. Wolfe. Highly recommend it. If you just want to learn a little bit about orange wines, where they came from originally, or not where they came from, but what regions traditionally produce these, some tasting notes. He gives you a list of producers in there from both old world and new world countries. So highly recommend that as well to help kind of expand your horizon. And last but not least, this was, and by no means this is my all of the books we've ever kind of you need in your wine life. There's a sommelier's atlas to taste, guide to taste. Like with Raj Parr, we had, of course, the actual wine atlas, the wine Bible. There's a ton of books that are both reference books and more. So we'll probably do another session on this. But without any further ado, we have The Dirty Guide to Wine by Alice Feiring with Pascaline Lepelletier. So our guest today is Alice Feiring, and she's a wine writer, been writing a wine for years, basically was kind of leading that push on trying to get away from the quote unquote parkerization of wine, trying to keep all wines, the fear that all wines were going to become a homogenous, basically monolith in style in the late 90s and early 2000s. So she was a vocal proponent of diversifying different styles, treating your wines with care, not just trying to make some mass produced product that was going to sell and basically make you money. She's a fascinating lady. Our interview was amazing. This book in particular, The Gertie Guide to Wine, it's really interesting because it takes a different tack on things. It doesn't tell you to break it down by region, like what wine style should be, or by variety. It basically goes by soil type. And you get to discover, they have a chapter on like limestone, and they have a chapter on like granite. And basically you can go through all of these different chapters and kind of get a general idea of one, what regions predominantly have these soils. There's some that you wouldn't really think of, or some you've never really thought of the soils. Two, then you can start trying to draw some parallels between wines grown on the same soil, but in different areas, and trying to see if you can see any through lines between the wines, or if basically their varietal character is consistent, or how that soil impacts that, and then layer that with weather, climate, other aspects of terroir. So it's a really interesting book. I thought it was really helpful in terms of opening my eyes into what regions kind of had some actual similarities in terms of their soil. And in that same sense, allowed me to kind of do some tasting lineups that I wouldn't have thought of otherwise. Really great recommendations from producers. Pascaline obviously has her input in some of this style here. She's one of the best sommeliers in the world. So, and obviously a lover of the Loire, but she's a lover of terroir everywhere. So it was a great read. I've listened to it. I've read it. I go back to it regularly just to kind of refresh myself on different soils, types, and regions. So highly recommend it. This interview, without further ado, we will have Alice Feiring. Enjoy the interview. All right, we are here with Alice Feiring. Thank you so much for joining us today, Alice.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I've been trying to coordinate with Alice to get her on the podcast. I've actually been a fan for a while now. I read your Dirty Guide to Grapes, or Dirty Guide to Wine, sorry, with Pascaline a couple of years ago. I've actually listened to it multiple times now. And then when we were thinking about guests to have, I was like, oh, Alice would be a great person to have, because you also have a number of other books. So could you kind of touch on a little bit about your background, maybe all of your books, and we'll dive into a little bit more in specifics of some of those, and then kind of what your main ethos is in the wine world, or your main focus.
Okay. God, that's a very broad question. I could talk forever on it. How did I get into this? That's by accident. I never wanted to be a wine writer. That seemed, as it still does today, like a completely ludicrous idea. And it's only like to want to be a wine writer unless you're independently wealthy. It's basically making a pact with poverty. So that's really stupid. Totally stupid. But I was playwriting and I was writing fiction. I moved back from Boston after being there for a decade. When I was up there, I was tasting a lot of wine. I was tasting weekly because I happened to have a roommate who wanted to be in the wine business, and we had twice weekly tasting. So after 2 years, I thought, I'm looking at a wine list and I know what I'm looking at. So that's weird. And I kept it going. By the time I came back to New York, being the kind of writer who felt they needed to see a byline before the great American novel, I hit Broadway. I started doing journalism. So I was writing about food, wine, and design. And just like anybody else who starts in wine, I wrote about things that I liked. And it was all very separate. It was about bottles and maybe a little bit about a culture, but I hadn't really even stepped foot into a vineyard. Then, of course, years passed and I do step into a couple of vineyards, but I don't really, it's all very, it's like, really, milk comes from a cow, honestly. So it was that disconnect with wine really does exist. I realized all around me the wines that I cut my teeth on were changing. The wines that I loved were actually becoming extinct and fading into this whole, this parkerized, big, juicy, one world, one taste kind of wine. It was very upsetting. And I'd go to press events and all of my colleagues would be talking about it. And I'm talking the big boys, and I will say boys because they were all boys from Wine Spectator and all the other guys. They would all complain. But yet in print, they extolled the virtues of these wines. And I'm like, dude, you've got to be kidding me. And I was nobody. So it was like I didn't have a voice. I didn't have a platform.
Mm-hmm.
But I was writing for some good outlets. And when a friend told me about this technology in California that there was technology and complete computer program and consultants that would help people get 95 points in Parker through technology, I did that story for the New York Times business section. And that story kind of changed my whole life. I mean, first of all, I became a whistleblower in the industry. What? Technology? What? It's not just grapes. Like basically marketers are thinking up what the wine should taste like, and then you make it to that. It's just not an expression of nature. I mean, this was radical. Like nobody it never occurred to somebody that it never occurred to me. I got death threats. I got blackballed. I lost a lot of writing gigs because I became too hot to handle, and people were afraid of losing advertising if I wrote for the major glossies. Then, all of this was clicking away. And one day I decided to write for The Battle for Wine and Love, or How I Saved Parkerization. And that came out in 2008. And so since then, there have been, depending on how you count, 6 or 8 other books, with the last coming out last year. How'd I do? Did I answer the questions?
Yeah, no, that was amazing. Before we move on, who did they ever say? I guess the person who's issuing death threats never says, "I am this person. Here's a death threat." But could you tell what role in the business they were? Were they just
basically beating up, like you're not safe in this? I felt like I wasn't safe in California, basically, and I knew very well who it was. Who I'm not going to name. He was actually in the story. And he didn't realize the way he was going to come off, and he didn't realize, the negative reaction. And actually, honestly, when I was writing it, I didn't really understand the negative reaction either. From my point, these are people who were I was not writing in first person. It was a journalistic reported piece. Mm-hmm. I tried to give both sides of the story, even though the cynicism behind not just the technology, that was not as cynical as the person and the people manufacturing the wines to the purpose. So I was just putting it out there. I was kind of as surprised as he was that he was all of a sudden got a lot of blowback on it.
I think a lot of people don't think about how much wine is a business, and anytime there's a lot of money involved, people are going to get very angry. Exactly. If you're trying to stop them from getting as much money. So that makes sense, but that's intense.
It was intense.
Go ahead, Brady.
Around when was this, Alice?
That was 2001.
2001. And so obviously big shifts in the culture of wine in the US, but obviously just especially around how the wines of California are communicated and marketed since that time. Mm-hmm. How long did it take for some of that to wear off, or has it not, I guess? And what was it like coming out of that time period? Because you kind of talked about going into it, but what was it like coming out of it?
I had already started writing about, didn't call it natural wine before that, but I was already writing about natural wine. And at that point, at 2001, there were still some wines that I could find in California that I could drink. Not many, but some. And it just got worse and worse. And probably there were some because there was still some hanging out from the late 80s when it was still okay. But in 2011, when I was writing Naked Wine, that came out in 2011, that's when the first time, I never even mentioned natural wine in Battle for Wine and Love. So Naked Wine I was writing it in 2010, and there were a tiny clutch of people. And I had a California section in that book. And there were maybe 4 or 5 people that I can maybe drink them. So when you think about how long after that California came around, probably 17 years from like 2001.
Yeah.
And it's all pretty, the boom in California and the new wines that are coming out are all, with as many as there are now, is relatively new. Maybe 2015. I think that's when, or 2016, the first time Brumaire came out, something like that.
So what did natural wine mean to you then versus how has it changed, and what does it mean to you now? And maybe you talk about low intervention, these kinds of things, but yeah, can you talk about that?
It means the same thing to me now as it did then, even before, when I was talking about the word natural, which was native yeast fermentation, organic viticulture, nothing added, nothing taken away in the process, except just some minimal sulfites. At the time that I did that story for the New York Times, I thought the major culprit was toasty new oak and overripe grapes. I had no idea until I did that story the dramatic range of selected yeasts and what their power was, what they could do, and what they were marketed as doing. That was stunning for me. So after that, native yeast became absolutely incredibly essential, and also no acidulation. And so it's the same thing. I think natural wine it's not a movable goalpost. It is. It's really just a grape, and then you have the hand of the winemaker who's part of it, the choice of vessel that hopefully does as little as possible to impact the flavor while promoting grape health. So same thing.
Can you, just for our audience, go a little bit deeper on the yeasts, naturally occurring yeasts versus some of the yeasts that are added and what they can accomplish in a wine? Can you just do a little bit of an overview for our audience?
So wine in nice, healthy circumstances, basically the grapes have what they need to ferment without any assist. A healthy grape has what it's need. Now, Pasteur was the first person to work on yeast and start to identify and create selected yeasts that were still just cultivated from the vineyard. But it really wasn't until the 1930s that yeasts were available commercially for winemakers. And at that time, it was just a nice, potent yeast culture that kept the wine cranking along. There are things that can happen if there are not enough nutrients in the wine. If it's not really have everything that it needs, it might need a little bit of help. So that's why people started relying on selected yeast. However, back in those days, they were very simple. It's like baking bread with Red Star. Very simple. Nothing, not horribly unnatural about it. But with time, and this mostly happened in the late 70s and the 80s, where there was a whole industry that could pinpoint the chemistry of that selected yeast, because there are so many yeasts that are involved in fermentation. And that's the beautiful of native yeast fermentation, because it's not selecting. It's just Saccharomyces is going to win the race. But within it, there are all sorts of yeasts that maybe a modern winemaker might be scared of, like Glycosera, but adds a little bit of the complexity. And with the selected yeast, you are focusing on certain amount or one kind or a few kinds of characteristics that you want that yeast to bring out. So if you want your Gruner Veltliner to have characteristics like Sauvignon Blanc, you can select for that yeast. And in fact, for a long time, Gruner Veltliner really did taste and smell like Sauvignon Blanc, because that was the yeast that they were using. That's kind of like the best example I could give you. But it's fascinating reading, to go on to Scott Labs or some of the other guys and read their claims, which are kind of outrageous. Like, you want a wine to have like a red currant forward aroma. This is the one for you. You want to promote the Cabernet Sauvignon, like back down. This is one for you. So that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think You touched on it, especially with like aromatics. There are certain esters and other things that are specifically brought out of the wine during the fermentation process. Like I don't know if many folks know that like grape must before it's fermented, there's only a few grapes that actually smell kind of like they will when they come out. Like Sauvignon Blanc is one of them, but
yeah,
I think that's interesting.
Another one. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Grapey.
It's like that's the beginner one. Yeah, Muscat. Wow, I recognize it.
It smells like grapes. Oh, I got it all. Can you share a little bit more about your latest book and how maybe you've been able to, because clearly your life has been impacted by wine. Can you share a little bit about how your latest book kind of ties the two, your life and wine, together?
Sure. So that book was called To Fall in Love, Drink This, a wine writer's memoir. And the way that came about, well, I've always written essays, and I've been lucky enough to have a couple of modern loves in the New York Times and a bunch of other essays, personal essays written in the Times and elsewhere. And I wrote one in the beginning of the pandemic about drinking alone during the pandemic that was published in New York Magazine. And my agent said, I want a book of essays, which I said, well, that's great. So do I. But they're really hard to publish. She said, just write it and let me deal with it. I have been wanting to stop writing about wine for a long time. And I thought maybe this time, this will be my book without wine. But no, I was not allowed to do that. And so I basically created each one of the 15 essays, which is really about my life, though something about wine in them, but it really is it's about escaping serial killers. It's about that one drinking alone during the pandemic. It's about how I learned how to smell with my grandfather. I mean, it's kind of unusual for a wine book. There's not only serial killers, there's concentration camps and very significant moments of my life. First love, a guy who didn't drink. How do you deal with that? But for each one, I chose a bottle of wine, and it's not pairing it, which is a shtick that it's been done a million times, but a bottle of wine that I felt that was extremely significant. So for the one about my grandfather teaching me how to smell when I was a little girl, and by the way, drink at like 3, I decided to write an essay about talking about Muscat, and a bottle of aromatic wine and what that means. But they're also extremely personal. So there's Muscat, there's Barolo, there's Alto Piemontese wine and stuff like that. And I guess it's always hard for me to talk about personal work like that, about what it's like. But when both Bill Buford, who's an amazing writer, and Pete Wells of the New York Times, the dining critic, basically talked about it. It is a wine memoir, a wine book actually, it is just a book about life posing as a wine memoir. And so that was totally cool to read that. And when the art director finished it, she wrote me a note. And this is the first time an art director of any of my books have ever read my book, and said, I went right out to a wine shop. So
that's awesome.
That was one of the best pieces of feedback that I ever got. That was good.
Yeah. Yeah, it's cool when you can because those of us who drink a lot of wine and wine is integrated into our life, we know that those moments can't really be detached from the wines that we were interested in, or that define that kind of period of our lives. So I think that's really cool.
And especially because this person didn't really drink. And I think throughout my whole career, with a couple of exceptions for the books, I've been trying to seduce a cultural reader into caring about wine. Because one of the reasons that I really am fed up with wine writing is people don't care. Most people don't care. And that means that the reading audience is so tiny. And yet, I think before the 90s, people did care. People did care about reading. Wine was part of culture in a way that it just doesn't exist now.
Is that kind of how I was interested in your breadth of books too? You have one on Georgia where I actually didn't know you had written that, so I'm really excited to kind of dive into that one. But you have one on Georgia, like the Dirty Guide to Wine. I feel like and then the natural wine side of things, I feel like there are a lot of these stories and things that are you try to weave in, or you don't ever come at wine and just here's a wine on like Burgundy, and then you just like, or a book on Burgundy, and you just talk about wines. I feel like there's always more going on.
Right.
Was that all by design, I guess? Is that your approach? So you wanted to tell these broader stories and loop readers in who maybe are into travel or into, I don't know about the Dirty Guide geology, but
that was the Dirty Guide. I know that you wanted to ask me about Pascaline. That was a funny story, but I think that comes out of my fiction and playwriting background. Is that I'm a storyteller. So, and I chose. It was a very specific decision not to study wine more than I needed to, not to go for an MW, not to throw myself into that kind of background. I never wanted to do that. And so I think my books come out of, I kind of started making a name for myself as being an early blogger and sort of kept trying to get back to that blogging voice, which actually became a trap. But just that notion of enticing people to read a story, because if they read a story, well, maybe they'll begin to care a little bit about what they're drinking. So that was, but that's the way. And also there was another thing for both, actually for the first three books, The Georgian, Naked Wine, and The Battle for Wine and Love, I'm serving up a lot of technical information. In The Battle for Wine and Love, I mean, I go in deeply about stems and carbonic maceration, and I'm talking about chemistry, and I'm talking about tannins and tannin structure, which most people who are just interested in that bottle of wine could care less about. So I felt if I used my personal life, they will go with me even to chemistry. So it's very much conscious in that way.
Yeah. Can you talk about some of the differences between the wine culture where people would have read wine books, they wanted to read about wine, they wanted to talk about wine in maybe the late 20th century versus now? Can you just talk about some of the differences that you see or perceive in the culture around that?
Yeah, I'll try. But, at one point, wine literature was on the level of culinary literature. They weren't separated. They were together. There were a lot of narrative wine books. There was one beautiful one written by two Irish ladies at the end of the 19th century in the Vineland, which is about their trip to Bordeaux, which is completely charming. It really is. I highly recommend it. But it's this narrative about wine people and the culture and the food, and they were not separated. And I knew that my brain would blank out on this other one. Also, a lot of the stuff came out of Britain, but they were big books that were just novelistic. And then my theory is that when wine was reduced to the number, and this is another one of Parker's legacy, people said, oh, I don't have to read. I can just take the number and go to a store and I can read the wine note. And that is when wine literature really became reduced to what to drink, and here's the number. Mm-hmm. But, there's a lot of reissuing of some of these old wine books, mostly out of England, but, there were a lot in America as well.
Yeah, I feel like Kermit Lynch's On the Wine Route kind of does that too.
Right, and that was in the 80s. That was pre-Parker. I mean, Parker was around, but it was pre the boom in wine scores.
And re-released like not too long ago as well.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Sorry, Brady, cut you off there.
No, that's fine. I mean, that's a good point. But ever since then, wine narratives really don't do that well. I mean, oddly enough, that my best-selling book to date is the last one, because it's probably it's speaking to a more general audience.
Do you have a relationship with Robert Parker?
Best friends. Kidding.
Yeah. Can you talk about this
I haven't
kind of language
talked to him since 2007.
Okay.
Yeah.
The Parkerization piece, can you talk about that and just sort of how that, right. Just sort of that focus and how that came about and what the response maybe was.
Are you asking, Brady, the scoring, or are you talking about the style?
The style, because this is obviously like antithetical to how you approach wine. So I'm just curious about that dynamic.
Yeah, well, it's kind of interesting because I was first not going, that first book, when I invoked his name, it was going to not be a personal book, and it wasn't going to have his name in it. And it was a very lackluster proposal, and it was getting turned down. And I said, well, fuck it. I'm going to write the book I want to write, because if somebody buys it, great. And nobody's going to read it anyway. So I was fed up with those colleagues of mine who had power and weren't doing anything. So it was kind of a cri de coeur about how this one world, one taste was taking over, and basically the wiping out of the traditional wines of the world. So in that book, I was really going after the traditional wines, the old Barolos, the old Chiantis, when Champagne had life before it was owned by LVMH. And now I totally lost the train of thought. What did you ask me? Oh, I did.
Yeah, it's just I was just curious about kind of invoking.
Robert
Parker's name. Yeah.
Well, I didn't mean to. I used Parkerization instead of Robert Parker, because, and I was surprised that he got so offended, because it became bigger than him. I mean, the Parker effect, and I wasn't the first person to cite that Parker effect, but it was the effect. He didn't manufacture it. He was willfully ignorant that he had power. And for that, I do blame him that he didn't call it out more, and he just rode the wave. But anyway, so that was just it. It was the effect. There was nobody else that I could blame it on. Internationalization, sure, but who was responsible for who was the main person? So that's, so there you go.
Yeah. I think his coming along was at like this perfect confluence of, one, like technology also making a couple leaps and bounds into the wine side of things so they could have more control, and then adding that other layer of scoring on top of it made it more accessible to people, so that in turn drove sales at the end. So there was kind of like this weird set in time, I think.
Right.
Did you
kind of
and
joined at the hip kind of thing?
Exactly. And I think it's this perfect storm. Were you like, we've also had, we actually had Eric Asimov on the podcast recently, and he was lamenting the same thing. And he was like, back when I was earlier writing, we were worried about too much homogenization in wine, and now it's more exciting than it's ever been. Did you see the possibility for this immense transition in just like 20 years? Or did you think it was going to take a lot longer to transition away from this homogenous style, or was there going to be a rebellion like right away to better stuff?
I hadn't foreseen Instagram. I think it would have been a lot slower had it not been for Instagram. Twitter circulated and joined people and connected people, but because it wasn't image driven, it had not the power of Instagram, which really accelerated it like crazy. Before that, it was creeping along in a nice, slow level, but gaining traction. What I did envision, I knew that it would happen because there's a certain truth in taste. Of course, there's a great never-ending hunger for stuff that I have no time for, called fast food. I mean, I've never been in a fast food restaurant. I've never had that. It doesn't interest me. But a lot of other people, if you put down a beautiful tomato next to a pale styrofoam one, people are going to like that juicy tomato, or the peach off the tree instead of one that has been shipped around the world. So I think there is a truth in taste. Wine, however, is more complicated in taste. It's a little bit different, but there are so many people who have said to me, and because there's more ego attached to wine than food, have said to me, I thought I was supposed to like those wines, meaning the big boy international style, the big woody wines. And they were like, I thought I was supposed to, and then wow. And that's kind of a very cool reaction. So it was bound to happen, and co-opting of natural wine was bound to happen. What I had not foreseen, but that was just because I didn't think it through far enough, was an evolution of style in natural wine. And I think this is inevitable. So there's always styles. I don't know if there used to be that way like a century ago, but like right now, the style is for, and it's a kind of wine that I love, but crunchy, chillable reds. You can go to a lot of natural wine bars. And like I did with a friend last week who really wanted something big, and he's a natural wine drinker. There's nothing. So even as we have available, if we go to a normal wine store, thank God you're going to find something for everybody. But even in the natural wine world, we are getting a certain sameness as more people are not farming their own grapes and are making wine to a style. So even here in my lovely little natural wine world, it's an issue.
That makes sense. I'm like a history nerd turned wine lover, so like I try to read a bunch, and I'm still working my way through Hugh Johnson's Story of Wine. But it's funny because he does touch on some of these similar styles and trends and how it drives plantings in certain areas.
That's right.
It's crazy to see how that's happened over so long. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about what you think the impact of Instagram in particular has. Is it like that we're able to, the little winery in the middle of Alto Piemonte is able to show a photo of them working the land, or is it tourism? Because I had a thought recently that I read, like I mentioned earlier, on the wine route with Kermit Lynch, and he went to this small producer close Saint Magdalene in Cassis in France. Mm-hmm. And like I read about it, I was like, oh, that sounds beautiful. But it didn't strike me like where it was there to seek out the wine. And then this year, my girlfriend and I were planning a trip to Provence. I was like, oh, cool. Mm-hmm. And I go there. And now it's like, I took a picture because it's beautiful. And it's like, I shared that with everybody. So people would have heard about this vineyard that they probably would have never heard about, mm-hmm. even if they had read about it before. Is it the tourism? Is it the process? Is it a little bit of both that kind of opens people's eyes to the...
It's people who are respected. Well, it started out with that. Now it just could be anybody sharing labels on Instagram. Mm. And at first the French were all on Facebook, but now everybody's on Instagram. It was funny, like that one was on Facebook, that was on Instagram. And so it got to, and importers, especially importers that have become so full of marketing hype. Like now we've got quote marks, natural wine importers, and they're really pushing the metal to the floor on their hype and bullshit. And but the right marketing speak and the right groovy picture, and then all of a sudden somebody doesn't need to taste the wine and it's on my neighborhood shelves and I buy it and it's crap. So it's done a big disservice. I call them Instagram sommeliers, people who only buy it on Instagram. They don't have time to taste anymore. It's crazy. It makes me very sad.
Yeah. I know exactly what you're talking about.
But that is it. But it's a fantastic tool. I make plenty of discoveries on Instagram. Wow, that's cool. Who's that? And then I'll go and visit or whatever. And everything is more accessible. And yes, you make a lot of discoveries, but it's also extremely lazy.
What are some of the inputs that the wine producers, the low intervention producers, natural wine producers that you're interested in? What are some of the common inputs across their process or across their sort of the style that they employ in their wines that stand out to you and are most interesting to you?
Well, when you say inputs, immediately I think about either like adding something to the soil or adding something to the wine. So
I really mean more about like their process. It might be in the vineyard, or it could be just in terms of how they bottle and distribute their product, how they present their product, right. Any of those things.
Well, one thing in the vineyard that's really, really interesting to me now, especially when you meet and you hang out with extremely thoughtful vigneron, is how they're changing pruning to deal with climate change and viruses. And I find that fascinating, even though, I mean, put me with a pruner and a vine and I will invariably make the wrong cut. Pruning decisions are fascinating to me, and how that affects the sap and the flow and disease and flowering, and how that impacts the final result. The whole notion of regenerative viticulture is also very interesting. But also about style, it's interesting to see a lot of people adapt regenerative vintage culture in a place where it's extremely difficult to do that. And maybe they need to rethink about it. Like maybe they really should plow once a year, maybe. And inside the winery, well, it's kind of, I think about winemaking like paper bag dramatics. And inside the paper bag, you've got a bunch of grapes and you've got a vessel for winemaking. And you have some sort of choice for getting that grape into it. And then whatever is in that bag, I mean, is fair game. I very much appreciate the effect of clay. I love concrete.
Mm-hmm.
I'm having a new appreciation of wood, where before I'd want absolutely no wood contact. Lately, I'm tasting it like I'm spending a lot of time with Greek wines. And the Greek wines that I'm tasting that have spent, especially the whites that have spent time in old barrel, they have a depth. And I wish people would be more generally accepting about vessel. I think the point is to limit the taste of that vessel on the wine, but appreciate the differences and the choices that winemakers have. And in that, we're going to see this kind of Villa de France and really keeping the wine world extremely varied and exciting. But I love when people are able to work without temperature control and to basically, it's like, okay, let's see those gymnastic heats. Let's see what they can do. Let's see how complex they're going to get. But I also appreciate when a winemaker thinks they need to intervene and cool something down, because not every winemaker has the financial ability to lose entire year production. So I think that the drinker and the purist has to acknowledge that they may want to drink a certain kind of wine all the time, but the winemaker needs to make a living too. It's just so complex. I could keep on going, but I think I'm mostly attracted to crazy people doing crazy things. It is not difficult to make wine. It's not even difficult to make a drinkable wine that I would like to drink. It is magic to make an extraordinary wine. And thinking about that is fascinating.
Yeah, I agree. Are there particular regions where more of these winemakers are? Are you drinking wines from all over the world? I mean, you went to Georgian wines before, you've gone there, so I'm sure you have like a whole repertoire of Eastern European countries that you probably drink wine from that we don't even regularly see as well.
Well, I do. I'm still I love Georgian wine. Just love it. And it keeps on getting better and better as winemakers have more years under the belt and as they're really pinpointing, which they never really thought about, terroir. And like the terroir, the limestone in the West Coast is pretty extraordinary, really fossil-ridden clay limestones, beautiful stuff. And there's something very exciting when your terroirometer goes off and you go, holy shit, this place, man, I got the vibe here. And when you put that together with a wild winemaker who's interpreting the soil, I mean, it's thrilling. So as much as you can see, I'd like to stop writing about wine. There's something about it that still gets me excited. I'm very fascinated in post-Soviet countries. So yes, as I call it, the slow Czech area, Slovakia, Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic. And Hungary finally is making some wine that I can be interested in. Finally, it's really recent. But some things are surprising to me. I never thought I'd be loving the wines of Chile as much as I do now. Talk about a wine that had gone whole hog, new world. That was shocking. And I love the wines, especially for me, Tata and Bio Bio. Argentina still slow to come on board, still slow. Australia, I find, sorry, my friends in Australia, there are some wines that I find that I do like, and maybe it's the price point that keeps me from it. But I think that it's very hooked into a style, a very glue, barely there, maybe a little bit underwined style. It's a little shrill. trying to combat the overt heat and sunniness. Though recently I came across a couple of wines from, frankly, this wine is made by Bob. Hi, Bob, if you're listening. He's a subscriber to my newsletter, and I finally got to taste his wine. He's imported by Tess Bryant. And these wines knocked my fucking socks off. They were in that style, but they were complex and joyful. One was a Skinsey, and they were blends. I love blends. I love Vermont wines. There are a lot of places. Vermont, yeah, definitely a place that I'm, champion of.
Has California and producers there done anything to assuage your kind of how you're disgruntled? You said maybe there were 4 wines that you would have drank.
There were,
before.
and California, I think there are some people doing stuff that I really like in California. There are definitely people that I appreciate what they're doing and will drink, and new people on the block. I think Raj Par's new project outside of San Luis Obispo, Phelan Farms, and especially his Scythian. His blends are quite beautiful. And down there's Scar of the Sea and Lady of the Sun. The wines are beautiful. Hank Beckmeyer, I can't wait to see what Hardy Wallace is going to do in his next incarnation. The last vintages of Donkey and Goat were far better than any Donkey and Goats that I have had for all those years, and something has changed. If you can find some of the 2022s, go ahead and pick them up. So
I liked a little earlier Donkey and Goat. It's good to know they're even getting better.
Oh yeah, totally. And Brent Mayu's stuff, I think he's totally onto some stuff. That there's I don't know. Is it there's still, unless you can find really the old vines, they're still working with some very funky rootstock. But if you can get the old stuff on St. George or X10, when you find those old vines, which is so rare, they have so much to say. And some of the most moving ones I had, which was made by Abe Scherner from the Los Angeles Project, which Raj is part of too. And those vines are incredible, and what they produce can be incredible, especially handled by people who've been working for a long time. So I think California is inspiring, but I think it's been marred. I think it's been marred by bad rootstock, by irrigation, by planting where you shouldn't plant, and you're planting the wrong things. You don't call me crazy, which I'm sure people will, but I'm not sure Cabernet is what you should be growing in Napa. They're laughing all the way to the bank, but so as more like bring back Carignan. Carignan belongs in California, and Carignan is a gorgeous grape in California. So I still can go on and on about the failings of California, and yet there are people doing beautiful things, and more power to them. Because it's hard to do beautiful things there.
Yeah, luckily we are seeing a little bit more old vine Carignan, like from like Lodi and stuff. I live in Los Angeles, so I've seen a little bit more. I got to go to a tasting with Raj and Abe, which was really cool. So you're,
that Palomino?
I think those one.
Whoa!
Oh yeah!
Whoa!
So much of the stuff that they were doing, I was like, it was amazing. You would never guess where it came from or the grapes. So in your sense, that's cool. It's when you were mentioning Chile, so that was more like some of the cooler climate. Are you mainly looking at like some of their whites, or are you talking about some of the Pinots from up that way? I know they tend to be a little cooler.
Pais.
Nice.
Yeah. Pais. Nice. and the white blends, and you're doing Muscat with a lot of skin contact, which makes absolute sense because you got to dull that aromatic somehow. But the Pais is beautiful. Carignan that I've had, they're beautiful. Even Syrah from the north, there really is only one person that I like to drink. They're extremely, extremely old-fashioned. A very old-fashioned producer that is making wine in the way they used to in old cowhide.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I know. That was the first time I tasted that being a vegetarian. I had to get past that a little bit. But
now I got to get my hands on that.
Yeah.
For so long, wine was transported and stored in or in animal hides.
Right.
And I've been thinking about it. I'm like, what did that used to taste like? I think some mezcal might be aged in that too. So I'm gonna get my hands on that stuff. So moving, looking forward. I know we're getting close to our time here. What do you think? Where do you think the wine world's going to go in the next 10, 20 years? Are we going to go? Is it going to be dictated by climate change? Is it going to? I mean, money leads everything, but what do you think is going to be driving forces, and where is it going to take us?
We have just a few minutes now. So I know that I didn't answer your questions about Dirty Guide to Wine, which I want to very briefly, and then get on to the future.
That's great.
I wrote Dirty Guide to Wine because I got fed up. Well, actually, I was trying to do a memoir about a serial killer, but I wasn't allowed to. We want another wine book. I said, well, nobody reads wine books. I don't want to do another wine book. And so I decided I was going to write for that particular editor the geekiest proposal ever, and they were never going to buy it, which is the Dirty Guide. And basically drinking according to soil type instead of a grape. And they bought it. Oh, well, I wanted to write it because I got really fed up about people drinking wine by grape type, because it's almost, even though I was talking about grape type, I think it's the most boring way to learn about wine, and it's the least important thing. The right marriage is important, and where it is important. And then you go where it is, then you can just talk about the grape type. And after I wrote the proposal and it got accepted, you asked me, why did Pascaline, because she asked me to. She asked me, and I knew it would be far more involved with her doing it. So I had my trepidation, but I knew I was going to run everything past her anyway. So she might as well have her name on the book. So she made sure that I had Bordeaux in there because I was going to leave it out and stuff like that. And she made sure that she was great to work with. So that was that. Now, where is it going to go in the future? And that is where, are you sure you want to end on a really, really depressing note? Oh boy. Well, first of all, wine prices getting so high, I really don't know what's going to happen. And my advice to everybody is get a cellar and get as much wine in there you can possibly now, because in a few years, it's going to be really too expensive for most people to drink. At first, I thought that hybrids and the whole just ferment anything was going to be the way out, but now those are really expensive too. So, I mean, those should be inexpensive and they're not. That pisses me off. So that's one thing, but part and parcel, one reason not only are prices rising, but because it's going to be so hard to grow grapes. I have no idea what climate change is how. We know it's going to be completely unpredictable. This year, dealing with fires, with floods. What's next? How long can winemakers continue to make wine in a flood zone, in a fire zone, be hailed on? I mean, at what point? Back in the 30s, and I think there was another time in the 1800s that whole areas, like people just gave up. Like this happened in Alto Piemonte. That is why it's a strip mall now. People just gave up the vines and moved to the city. When is that going to happen? It's going to happen a lot. I think we're going to be looking at, I think even Nova Scotia is going to be too hot for grapes. We're going to be looking at Iceland and a whole other world. I think, yes, hybrids will come into their own, and we're going to be embracing a lot more peewees, as I call them in Europe. So it's one thing that I hate about the wine world is its elitism, and I just see it going more elitist. And that's another reason that I keep on thinking, well, time to go back to my fiction and memoir. It's, for me, just as we are about to make, because some of the most beautiful wines that ever made in the history of mankind. Is it going to be extinct? I mean, if the planet is running out of water, so maybe 10 years we're going to be safe. I really don't know what it's going to look like in 20 years. Certainly, people were looking at England. It's going to be too hot, isn't it? Good luck, Pinot Noir there.
Well,
maybe the Hebrides. We're going to maybe going north.
Well, at least Iceland has good volcanic soils, I assume.
They have great soil. There's so much lava, though, and so much hardened lava that's going to be a little bit difficult. But yeah, that's going to be interesting. They're going to have to do what they do in
Canary Islands.
In the Canary Islands is deal with the wind, but it's I just wish that there was a way to make a real wine at a user-friendly price for the people. I mean, I'm up to like $30, $35 a bottle. That's too much for me. It's not, thank goodness I can buy wholesale. That's not sustainable for me. Cocktails are far more sustainable. Maybe that's why there's a whole anti-alcohol movement, which I don't understand.
Yeah, we've mentioned a couple of times on the podcast how good of a value spirits are relative to wine, just on a per drinks basis.
Absolutely.
Cocktails will come back.
Yeah, exactly.
One last question before we wrap up here. Do you know David Keck? Speaking of
David, yes.
Nice. Yeah. He's one of our, well, we've only had him on twice, but he's a friend of the program, and we have him on David. At least once a year. So
I've written about David a lot in my newsletter.
Oh, good, good. I'm happy because we asked somebody else mentioned Vermont wine on the podcast, and we're like, David, and you're like, no. So I'm happy somebody's like helping promote his wines.
Yeah, actually, I did a big Vermont issue on the Feiring line, and I visited him. I visited him in the middle of the pandemic, and the woes. Oh my God! But I just cracked out a bottle of his Marquette. Man, it was an Uncle Marquette. God, it was so beautiful. Every time I open up a bottle of his wine for somebody, they're just like, whoa.
That's so exciting.
He's doing great things. So yes, Dave is fantastic.
That's awesome.
Awesome. We're both going to go visit him separately this fall.
Yeah, we'll be up there this fall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Alice.
It was a hoot. Thank you for having me on.
Appreciate your time. Hopefully we'll stay in touch and we can talk to you again down the road, okay?
By all means.
All right.
Okay. Thanks.
All right. And that was our interview with Alice Feiring. I hope everybody loved her different points of view and her journey. There's an underlying passion for wine, no matter how your wine journey goes and how you want to meander. There's always that passion. It was a great interview. I hope everybody else enjoyed it as much as I did. All right. Well, we will be back next week, and Brady will be back in the studio. So we'll have both of us. But until then, have a good week. Cheers.
To check out our current offerings and to sign up for the Vint platform, find us at www.vint.co. That's www.vint.co. For questions, comments, or feedback on the Vint podcast, please email us at support@vint.co. Vint and VV Markets are offering securities pursuant to Regulation A. Our offering circular as amended can be found on the SEC website. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Investments such as those on the Vint platform are speculative and involve substantial risks to consider before investing. We may provide communication that may contain certain forward-looking statements that are subject to various risks and uncertainties. Information provided in any communications, including this podcast, is not legal, business, or tax advice. All prospective investors should consult a legal, tax, or business advisor concerning the subject matter of any communications and any offering.